Can you hear me? Okay, now I can. Okay. I was sort of having deja vu from the cell phone commercials. But my name's Kelsey Funes. I'm on the board of CPEX. And I'm so happy to greet you guys and welcome you back for the last session of the summit, which will be outstanding. One of the jobs that I have with the board is membership. So I want to give a plug for that too. But first, I want to thank our session sponsor, Leah Michaels Fine Jewelry, plus all the summit sponsors who are listed in the program and in the slideshows between the sessions, because we really couldn't put on the Stellar Summit without that support. And that leads me to my membership plug. So what when we talk about membership in CPEX, what we're talking about is people joining us, making investments, and helping us to finance and put together some of these plans that don't necessarily have owners. And so one of them is Better Block and the Government Street Project that, if anybody's been around Baton Rouge or from Baton Rouge, is familiar with. Projects like that that really sort of elevate the community and make big impacts but don't have an owner need to be funded. That planning work needs to be funded. And so we've started what we call the Visionary Circle to create a sustainable chain of funding to help us work on those projects when there isn't necessarily a client per se, or the client is the community. So I encourage you to check it out on the website. Join us in the Visionary Circle. We'd love to have you. Next, I want to talk about Mike Lydon, who's our last speaker today. He is an internationally recognized planner, writer, speaker, and advocate for livable cities. He's the founding principal of the Street Plans Collaborative, an urban planning, design, and advocacy firm working to create successful public spaces and increase the effectiveness of active transportation as a means to creating more competitive and sustainable 21st century towns and cities. I know that he will be taking a look at some of the Government Street project that we have here and doing an audit, and so I'm thrilled to have him here, and I hope you enjoy his presentation.
Hello. The last time I was here, it was 2019. That feels like it was not 3 years ago, but 30. But it's really nice to see all of you again. I think we had some digital interaction in 2021, but nice to see people in person. And thanks to CPEX for having me back once again. This is a really wonderful conference, and each time I come, I learn more about Baton Rouge, I learn more about Louisiana, and I'm going to try and share some of my top-level learnings as part of this presentation. Very quickly, we are based in Miami, recently Atlanta, and in New York City, which is where I'm based. We do a lot of, traditional planning projects, right? Plans for walking and cycling, corridor plans, master plans. We also do a lot of detailed implementation design work. So really getting through the technical things of materials and geometric design and helping communities truly, change their streets and their public spaces. And then my favorite part is we work with folks like yourselves, with community members, advocates, activists, business owners to go out and actually build this stuff with our hands. And so I'm going to speak to that in a little bit. But I think for this presentation, I want to get a little bit back to the fundamentals of smart growth. And really where I started my career was much more in line with, with smart growth principles and working on new urbanist projects and urban design and thinking about big scale things and problems and challenges. And I think the way I could summarize that today is land, transport, and climate. Now, growing off of what we've heard yesterday and today, all these things are linked, right? They're all connected. And now, more than ever, we need to find the places where those overlaps exist and to double down on our investments and our time and our energy to improve all those things collectively. And at the end, I'll get to the tactical urbanism in terms of our response. So with land, here in Louisiana, land is not, it's not a definite thing, right? It's shifting all the time. And I think we've seen more and more with climate, with storms, with impacts, that's having not just an impact on the natural environment, but we're seeing on our built environment where we live and how we live together is becoming more and more challenging, right? So as you look into the impacts of storms here, sea level rise, et cetera, it becomes a very dire threat on not just being able to live where we live, but be able to return to these places and rebuild time and time again. So what I'm really getting at is housing, right? How we occupy the land collectively. And we're not doing a great job of that nationally. It's not, you have specific challenges here in the state, but at the scale of the country, we're simply not building enough housing to meet the demand, particularly for moderate and low income housing. And so the pandemic, this global issue, is affecting the national conversation around housing, but then all the way down to the local level with, inflation and smaller households that have been forming, taking up, housing that's available. Airbnb, maybe not such a problem in some communities, but take New Orleans. That's a major challenge in terms of available housing. Rising mortgage rates as of late. And then, of course, we've got this structural challenge and problem of zoning codes and local politics that continue to limit or stymie the production of new housing. All things collectively national crisis. Now, these issues play out in unique ways, as I understand, here in Louisiana. But what I think you're really seeing is a dramatic shortfall of affordable housing to those who are moderate, yes, but also very low income. I've given some version of this talk 5 times this year, and each time I can go to this one study that looks at every state and their housing issues, and I can pull up the new data and the new information, and it's the same story over and over. You're just like every other state. There's not enough housing for those who are cost burdened. Again, the issues kind of play out a little bit differently at every region, every community level, but it's a challenge that is mostly impacting those who are low income and minority residents. We have this need to not just think about housing as this broad stroked approach of just units, but the kinds of housing that we can build can be adapted and fit into the communities that we all live and advocate for. And so what we're talking about is a more diversity of housing choice, which sounds great and sounds obvious, right? Sure, I should be able to live in a cottage, a townhouse, an apartment building, a single family home, but in so many places, this is still illegal, right? You can build the single family house, or you can build the large sort of downtown style multi-story apartment building. Everything in between, what's called the missing middle, from Dan Perolic and his firm at Opticos, they coined that term. Everything in the middle is very, very challenging to do. And if we could build that finer grain density, we'd be able to improve the walkability, we'd be able to improve affordability, and I think to come up with housing choices that are more amenable to the different types of neighborhoods where people tend to react to one or the other in a negative way. Where I sit from the perspective of smart growth is, where should this housing be built? And where should it be built for those who need affordable housing? I think many of us would agree it needs to be in and around our downtowns. And like all states in the US, there's many great downtowns that are in need of more people to occupy the businesses, to make the streets safer, and to help turn the economy up a level and move forward. Housing is a really key element to that, but again, if you're not allowing housing to be built, and it's not meeting the market demand there, then the challenge is clearly that we don't get enough housing. So Baton Rouge has come a long way, as I understand, in the last couple of decades. Infill housing, new businesses downtown, where we're gathering today, has made a lot of progress here. But I think you can also look around town, just here in the small center, and see how many potential opportunity areas there are. These are the parking lots. These are just surface parking lots, not structured, but surface, that still exist around town. Now, I'm sure there's reasons at the lot level, the parcel level, why some convert and some don't, but I can still look at those from the outside and say, you're not full in your downtown. You've got room for lots more people to be living here and living in a lifestyle that is walkable, low carbon, and I would say, convivial and fun. So planners, one of the biggest challenges we have is to continue working on code reform, zoning codes, parking regulations, everything that is embedded in the way we use land is still not to the point where we can build housing, build a mixed-use walkable environments that there's massive demand for around the country. And when we think about those types of places where we build the missing middle, the downtowns, the walkable neighborhoods, those are the ones that subsidize the places that are not. And so I pulled this study from Urban 3, some of you might know Joe Minicozy, as well as Chuck Marone. They team up a lot on this kind of work where they look at the tax revenue that's thrown off into a community from various development patterns and building types. And they did a study, as it turns out, of Lafayette. Is anyone from Lafayette here? A few of you, are you familiar with this study? Yeah. What's so interesting about this work is they draw the same conclusion in almost every single place that they work, which is that the downtown, the walkable, the mixed use, the diverse building types produce net positive more revenue for a community that helps subsidize what we see as the sprawling, low density, auto-oriented development on the edge. The more you do the latter, the harder it is to balance the checkbook, so to speak, at the municipal level, right? So, expanding the infrastructure is costly. When you don't have the density to do it, it doesn't pay for itself, like, a denser walkable development does. And so this plays out at a very local level. You can pick any building in two different types of environment in a city, whether that's New York or it's Baton Rouge, and you can find this to be true, which is that if you use the key metric of value per acre, so how much tax revenue is being thrown off on a per acre basis, you find that what we think is a big revenue producer for a community, such as the Sprouts Organic Market towards the edge of town, which throws off, actually has a tax value of over $35,000 per year, is actually less than the small micro Capital Grocery, which I was so charmed by in my walk around Spanish Town, on a per acre basis does 74% better. So if we had more Capital Groceries embedded in our neighborhoods, whether you're downtown or you're towards the edge, you're much better off in terms of being able to pay for the infrastructure that services that neighborhood. That's stormwater, that's sidewalks, that's police, schools, etc. So if we really want to be economically productive in our communities, you've got to think about having more things that are in the black and not in the red. So more Capital Groceries being allowed to be built in our neighborhoods, and perhaps a few less of the organic markets on the edge of town. So we move to transport, which is my personal passion. I love this quote from the outgoing CNU president, which is, when we build our landscape around places to go, we lose places to be. I think it's a pretty profound statement about how we've approached transportation for the last several generations. So since 1950, our country has doubled in population, but we're driving 7 times more in terms of vehicle miles. So double the population, 7x the amount of driving. And when you look historically at streets as conduits of goods and people around communities, around regions, around our country, historically there's 2 different types. There's the roads that connect the places, and within the places there are streets. A road is high speed, it's low accessibility, meaning there's not a lot of intersections, not a lot of things going on that street. They're lower in connectivity, lower value per acre, and low complexity. That's a road, right? It's a rural road. A street, a main street in particular, is low speed, high accessibility, high connectivity, and a high value per acre, as I showed with the market in Spanish Town, but also a high complexity. The issue has come as we've focused on going places, as we've lost the places to be, or what Chuck Marohn calls the strode, right? Which is as he coined it, the futon of transportation options. It's not really good for either walking or even good for driving, right? These places are actually quite dangerous. They get congested. There's no place to walk. All the buildings get set off the street, et cetera, et cetera. But this tends to be what we build, right? This is a version of Government Street before it was put onto a road diet. And every city in America has far too many of these kinds of streets. As it turns out, they're deadly, right? They're deadly particularly for pedestrians. And as we've seen over the last decade, pedestrian fatalities have only increased. Our vehicles get safer, being inside the vehicle, right? But being outside the vehicle is less safe. Since 2020, we've seen more than 10% spike in fatal crashes, more than 43,000 people a year. This is an epidemic level of crashes that continue to happen. And I think, having heard from Christopher earlier today, we're finally getting federal leadership on this topic, on this issue, and seeing real resources being put towards reversing this trend. So what are the reasons behind it? Well, there's many. I actually shared this graph a few years ago here, or some version of this graph, but we've seen the types of vehicles being sold are bigger, they're heavier, their market is being able to go faster, and they do go faster. And when you add those things up, when there is a collision, that increased size and weight and speed is deadly. So again, maybe it's safer to be on the inside, but it's not safe to be on the outside. And as we know, these crashes are not experienced equally, nor the fatalities. So if you are black or brown, you have a much higher fatality rate than you do if you are white or Asian. And this plays out in community after community after community across the United States. So I submit we can't keep doing this, and yet we do. This is not Louisiana. This actually happens to be Arkansas, but it illustrates the point that the more oriented we are towards doubling down, tripling down, quadrupling down on this system, we're not going to solve for these challenges in Louisiana or elsewhere. And you still see these projects being proposed back to Lafayette with I-49 and that expansion. I don't know much about this project, so I can't comment too deeply on it, but when we think about equity and all the things that Chris talked about today and reconnecting our communities, doubling down on an interstate highway that goes through a neighborhood that's low income is exactly the wrong way to go. And if we think that moving forward, that gas cars can be replaced by electric cars and solve the problem, unfortunately that's not the case. Same with self-driving cars. At the end of the day, a car is a car geometrically. This is another favorite tweet of mine recently from Hayden Clarkin, who goes by the Transit Guy, where he looked up the parking regulations of Cupertino, California, which is where our iPhones are made, all right, where Apple's headquarters is. If New York City, if the Empire State Building had the same parking regulations as are required in Cupertino, everything inside that orange line would be a parking lot. Right, so you see that kind of regulatory environment all over the U.S., which is why you don't see the high productivity being built in city centers around the country. So parking, just go back to that graphic of downtown Baton Rouge, it's really hard to achieve all your other climate goals, accessibility goals, transportation goals, walking goals, housing goals, if you're building and mandating too much parking. And we've seen this as a national reform movement that just in the last 6 weeks seems to be picking up more and more steam, where finally communities are actually getting rid of their parking mandates within their zoning codes. We're not requiring a certain threshold to be built, which means that a lot of those spaces can actually be not built as parking, but as housing or other more productive uses. So this tide is turning. It'd be great to see more and more of these reforms adopted across the state here. And then I think this is a good lead-in to the climate conversation is, again, as Christopher mentioned earlier today, transport became and still is very much so the number one offender when it comes to CO2 emissions. So if we're going to create a leverage point on reducing our emissions here in the US, we've got to really look to the transportation sector, which is primarily driven by how we all move around our communities, right? That 7x growth in driving since 1950, that's us driving around, emitting and polluting. And so while e-vehicles may solve some of that on the margins, it's not going to solve the overall problem of needing to drive everywhere for everything. So I'm inspired by what you've done here. I'm inspired by the Greenway, right? This feels like a place to go and a place to be, right? It's a place that moves people through efficiently, but it's also beautiful, and you just want to be in this space. The last time I was here, I don't think I quite fully experienced your downtown Greenway, and this time I made sure to prioritize spending an hour yesterday. I went on a run this morning. I ran this a couple different times. Truly is I think model facility to think about for your communities. So transitioning into climate, this was a great quote that I picked up yesterday from an article, which is about this challenge and paradox, here in Louisiana as other places, that a lot of our historic decisions, policies, racism is now coming kind of back home to roost, so to speak, in the form of climate change, right? And this is a very, very serious challenge, which obviously you know much about. But when I think about making changes, all of the sum of our local decisions for generations have led to this sort of global outcome. So while it's very overwhelming to think about global warming at the macro global scale, all of us have powers to change things at that local level. And I think what's fascinating and daunting is that we're not seeing just one storm, but multiple storms. And multiple storms interacting with a global pandemic during a housing shortage, right? So we're seeing these things start to get overlaid on each other in a way that's very scary and very hard to respond to, comprehensively. And that to me is a massive warning sign about how we plan for our future and how we occupy our land together. And again, just like with the pandemic, as with storms and housing, there's a massive inequity baked into the system. So what are we doing about that? You know the outcomes here that are projected for Louisiana. They're not that dissimilar from New York or Pennsylvania or Arkansas or Rhode Island, other places where I've given this talk, but they're not great, right? The projection is not great. Your state is probably doing as much as anyone to take collective action. And this is stuff that's going to play out over, decades, over generations, but making this investment and making these changes now and moving forward is obviously critical to the economic, social, cultural, identity and health of Louisiana. So if that's the high level sort of fundamental picture, it doesn't look great, right? But I think the response is where I find a lot of joy and a way to connect with people on a local level for starting things that are small, starting things that are low cost, and trying to come up with a way to deal and tackle some of these issues and quickly, because that's the timeline that we're on. We have to get things done yesterday. So does anyone know where this street is? New York. It's Broadway in Soho. You would think New York is this great metropolis with transit and walkable, but trust me, we've got lots and lots of challenges and issues around climate, mobility, safety, et cetera. And we were fortunate enough to work recently on a plan to overhaul Broadway through the Soho historic district. And so we came up with this vision after much engagement, many conversations, working through issues around deliveries, public space, safety, sanitation, all those things that make this area function, and try to make it function better for people. Now, I can tell you, when we do these sort of projects, you go from today and tomorrow, and then this is the day after. Doesn't matter where you are, people don't like change. And I can tell you, particularly wealthy, older people from Soho don't like change. And understandably, people who've lived there for many decades, they've seen it go from being a sleepy arts community to being this global shopping and office district, which to them is not desirable. So they see this and they think, we don't want that. We'd rather have the status quo than invite more people to be in our neighborhood. But this is the deal, right? When we show people long-term, renderings and pictures, which we do, right? But we don't connect that to an actual experience. That change on the screen seems scary. That change on the screen, which is presented entirely over Zoom in 2021, is even scarier, right? Because you don't have a chance to get in a room and build trust with people. And it's sort of overlaid onto this, obsession with big, large-scale, long-term projects, which are complicated. And by the time they get built, oftentimes outdated and don't serve the people that are there today when it was planned for decades before and finally gets built. We suffer from that massively in New York City, where we build infrastructure that comes to fruition a generation later and doesn't meet the need. And oftentimes I find it's because we're baking into this system the typical ways that we do outreach. And we talked a lot about this in the panel, the two panels that I sat on or watched this afternoon, is like, how do you get to the community? How do you have a real conversation? As a planner, you're like, I know this is better. We should do this. This is going to be safer. And the community looks at you like you're crazy, And that divide and that bridge is entirely about trust. And when we just show pretty pictures, that is one of the biggest challenges we have. I think that alone builds the trust. Now, does anyone recognize this picture? It's from the Government Street Action Plan from 2004. So, looks familiar. So it's interesting. I'm definitely a liberal, right? But I do have a problem with liberal governance legitimizing, their work through process alone. We need to focus on outcomes. This is one of my favorite quotes from a professor at the University of Michigan, is we just, in essence, need more doing, right? The doing is going to give us the outcomes or help us work towards those outcomes that we need in our neighborhoods. And so Jaime Lerner, the great, mayor of Curitiba, thought to be the inventor of bus rapid transit, architect, said to innovate is to start. And I think that's like the simplest, cleanest way to summarize what we believe so passionately, which is we have to start with something. We can't just tell people or show people pictures. They need experiences. They need to experience that change on the ground. And that is the essence of what we call tactical urbanism, a very wonky way of saying start with something small, see how it goes, and invest in the things that work. And if we connect that to plans and strategies and policies, the outcomes that we seek to have can be informed better and they can happen faster in the short and the midterm. And so what it really is a methodology about iterating, right? Getting something done very quickly, learning and testing, and then refining and keep going. So it kind of feels like we're, tomorrow on Government Street, we're kind of going to this next iterative process, right? There's been a lot of work done. There's been plans, there's been better blocks, there's been a road diet, with the state. Like that's a major, major win for Baton Rouge. But can we go further? I think we can. What's the next iteration? So the idea here is that you move from that long-term, big picture only, and then there's these different ways to think about change delivery through demonstration projects, pilot projects, interim design, to help you arrive at better capital projects. And so I won't go into all the details of the words there. You can certainly hopefully get my presentation later if you're interested. But the point is, we have all these tools with different materials, different ways to do engagement, ways to collect data, ways to do maintenance, et cetera, that fit into these options that all can precede long-term lasting infrastructure investments. And I think we're smarter for it if we start small and then we iterate. And we've seen this work, having practiced tactical urbanism now for a little over a decade, we're seeing a lot of these early projects that started off looking kind of, cheap and not serious, turning into lasting long-term investments. And this is a great example from Penrith, Australia, which is one of the first projects that we did internationally in 2013, led to a pilot, which led to lots of refinements and iterating, which 5 years later turned out to be what you see in the lower right. That 5-year timeline, that tends to be about typical with a lot of the projects. Start with something over a weekend, a week, a month, let it, simmer, see what people think, and then you move on and see, invest in the things that continue to work. And we think this helps build that political will, helps people have that experience, helps them point to things they like and don't like in real time, in an unstatic way. And as a culture, we've grown used to this. We call it versioning, and software works like this. Now, cities aren't software, but you can see that we are expecting that update on our phones, on our apps, and that continuous improvement is something that is now more baked into the culture. And that's kind of how tactical urbanism has operated over the last decade. It started off in, sometimes in the middle of the night, cheap and cheerful often, sometimes permission, sometimes not. And it's really matured and evolved into a project delivery framework that can address a lot of different needs and a lot of different situations, including responding to a global pandemic. So I'm going to move pretty quickly through these two slides, but suffice it to say, whether you're before a planning process, during, after, moving through that cycle of demonstration to pilot to permanent, there's lots of ways to use this methodology, and this is just 10. But I think as I move into my case studies to end here, I want to talk about crisis response. And we've seen tactical urbanism be very, very effective at responding to floods, earthquakes, the global pandemic being the most recent, where we had this sudden need, particularly in city centers and more urban places, to stay further apart. And it turns out that was very, very difficult given the condition of our built environment. I just love this example from this artist in Toronto who was told to stay, apart from his neighbors, and he went out in the middle of the street with a 6-foot radius around him and showed how difficult that actually was. But we saw this incredible response and creative response around not just the country, but the globe, to the demands of the pandemic. And really you could take all these, all these interventions and classify them as we did, and look at how, not just responding to a crisis, but how do you use that crisis to inform and leverage and respond to the needs longer term, not just now, but also longer term. And so there's this whole menu of things that have kind of come out and emerged from the pandemic, which inform now more permanent investments. And I'll show a couple examples of that. But in total, this is probably way out of date by now, but as of June or July 2020, this was the number of cities that had taken action across the globe. And so we were able to partner with a few organizations to kind of track this stuff, to try to understand what people were doing, what was working, and eventually what turns into permanent action. But I think overall the lesson that streets have just tremendous value for our communities. When we only use them for mobility, they are not fulfilling their potential. Now this happens to be my neighborhood in New York, but you could make this a main street in Louisiana. 2, 3-story buildings, mixed use, historic, little downtown street. That's exactly what this kind of environment is. And when we repurpose that space, even if it's temporary, you can get a lot of value. In fact, so much so that New York City credits the pandemic response to allowing restaurants to take over sidewalks, the curb, even whole streets, for saving 100,000 jobs at a time when those jobs and many more were threatened. If you do the math, you can find that the tax revenue thrown off by more outdoor dining is significant, 500% greater than spending $2 an hour on a meter in a commercial zone. So the value is real. And I think what's really interesting is we're starting to see communities leverage that value and invest it in equity priority areas, as San Diego is doing. So now there's a sliding scale on how much restaurants have to pay, depending on if they're an equity priority area or not. And then those resources from the program get reinvested into the streetscapes of the communities that need it most, right? So that's a really smart policy on how you take what we learned from the last couple of years and the physical changes, formalize it, and leverage that value creation to invest in neighborhoods who need it. And we're seeing this temporary, and sort of iterative approach go to the next level in New York City and beyond. This is 34th Avenue in Queens. It's one of the neighborhoods that has the least open space in all of New York City. Is also one of the hardest hit by the pandemic, and so they turned a whole mile-plus long street basically into a linear park. We looked at reimagining that for the long term, but of course this is the first step, right? This is stuff you can do in small towns, small communities, small cities. These are planters, some surface treatment, and just having the will to experiment with different traffic patterns and opening up that space to people to use in a different way. It just takes a little imagination, but not a lot of money. And so I wanted to underscore, that's New York, right? But we've been working on tactical urbanism projects in communities of all sizes, including many, many small towns. And I feel like when we work in a small town, it's just easier to get to yes. They might not have the same amount of resources, but there's a lot less process, there's a lot less, bureaucracy, and the creativity and the involvement tends to be higher in those places. So these are all communities that are, I think the biggest one, Great Falls, Montana, is about 60,000 people, but most of these are 10,000 people or less, where we've done work, and many other examples from across the country have been applied to, moderate-sized or small communities. So I'm going to end with just 3 examples from our work, maybe get into a couple of the details that might be of some interest to you all. This is a program in the Los Angeles region, which the MPO is called SCAG. It's kind of an unfortunate name, but it's the Southern California Area of Governments. They oversee an area the size of Connecticut. And this is actually a project that was funded by SCAG, but for a town called Ojai, which is population 7,000 on the very fringe of the LA metro area. And they have this state road. State road. The state road that goes through their community that connects a large open space with a high school, with some commercial businesses in the downtown. And that street has long been thought to be too wide, overbuilt, unsafe, lack of connectivity to the school and the open space. And so the plan was drawn up, and a plan was funded by the state to take this, this large roadway and convert it into a safer, more complete street. So this was SCAG, this was Caltrans, the state DOT, this was the local municipality, and it was and the residents. Many residents involved from the get-go on how we could shape this street, go from the plan that was on paper, and then try and test out elements to see if that's the plan they actually want to build. And so through outreach, lots of design development with the state and other partners, developing an implementation plan, and then we built it with community partners from the neighborhoods surrounding the corridor. And so I won't get into the details, but yes, we had to wrestle with Caltrans, and amazingly, we were able to get their buy-in to experiment with materials, to work with the community to take liability over for the actual quick build project, and then we were able to simulate, using with this design and these materials, we were able to simulate many elements of that proposed design, one of which was these planters were just proxies for where they want to build street trees into the street to separate on-street parking spaces. So the planters become the approximation or the simulation of that, which according to Caltrans, these are non-standard, but we were able to get them permitted. So there you get the before, and then you see the after. Maybe not one of our most colorful transformations, but you can see the sheer amount of space those taken back. So protected bike lanes, we did curb extensions, crosswalks, and we tried a couple different configurations along the corridor, before and after. And like with any project of this scale and scope, collecting the data pre and post is critical. So, long story short, what are we testing and what kind of outcomes do we get? All these things, right? We're looking at, access to hospitals. Is there more cut-through traffic in the neighborhoods? What are the volumes pre and post? Do we get a gain and do we see a reduction in speeds, et cetera, et cetera? Really quickly, this project was installed with 2 months of pre-count data, and then we went and collected data for many months after. And what we found was that the vehicle counts increased, actually, because this was going from 2020 into 2021. So with COVID returning more to normal, that caused that. But also pedestrian increases of 73%, bike activity by 70%. We saw dwell times by vehicles, or a proxy for congestion, increase by 1 second by taking away 2 travel lanes, so just 1 second extra. And then vehicle speeds, vehicles that were going over 40 miles per hour were decreased by 58%. So pretty remarkable outcome based on a relatively quick and inexpensive change. 900 survey responses in a town of 7,000 people is pretty good. We got negative, somewhere in the middle, and very positive feedback based on various elements, all of which is being used to help design the final project. So we think it's a smarter project with a better outcome because of the testing. And at the end of the day, we feel like, sure, all the data is great, but we involve people who live there, who go to school there, to deliver this project. And there's no way to simulate that or do that other than just doing it collectively. It has a much different outcome than just hiring a contractor and letting the contractor do their thing, where there's very little engagement. I'm going to just end, because I know we're going a little over time, so I'm going to end with this one more, which is how you scale something small to something bigger, which if you've not worked on these projects, I would highly recommend you start with something very small before you try to take on more. So this is a project in New Britain, Connecticut. It's a small New England city, about 15 miles south of Hartford. And it's a low-income city. This is a low-income neighborhood. This is the east side of the city. And we were working on a complete streets plan and policy with also with the MPO, as it turns out, what they call the COG there. And through feedback from the neighborhood, there's a YWCA on the corner, lack of open space. They wanted to see more park space and safer streets. And so New Britain is known as a very working class city. The beehive is their symbol. And so we kind of took a honeycomb approach with the design itself to kind of build off something familiar with their city colors. So very sort of simple, asphalt art design. And then we had to work through, as any project like this, many challenges, including we were doing this in October. And as we were planning for just dozens and dozens of volunteers to show up, we found out it was going to snow on the very day that volunteers were meant to be there. So we had to move everything up, which meant losing our volunteers, which meant speeding up our work, and made for a very challenging environment to install in a way that we didn't exactly envision. But that's the Tactical Urbanism project in a nutshell. So there's a layout, and there's the delivery. We did get some volunteers, including the mayor, come out throughout the day. And then that you can see in the aerial some of the results there. So preserving some of the local access for the residents, but then almost doubling the size of that mini little park, which was desired by the neighborhood. And of course, the next day it snowed. So not a problem you have here, necessarily, I hope, too often. But yes, we had 2 feet of snow on Halloween, which is not typically the case, but it's global weirding. And this was not fully accepted once it happened. And I think if there's any electeds in the room, this is your job to stay patient and to try to stay, focused on what are the goals and are we achieving those goals, right? And this is the client about 5 months later emailing me and saying, this mural has not been accepted, it's not working out, we're probably going to have to remove it, there's a public meeting, everyone's angry. Then he wrote this email on the right the next day saying, oh my gosh, it's great, people love it. They said there's less, drug activity, kids are using it to ride their bikes, we want to see it made permanent. End of his email was, our plan is to expand the park area by the end of the summer. So, that's the point. You have to let it play out. And some people who are loud and angry may not represent everybody. The more of the representational feelings about these projects tend to show up when it's time to show up, and they did. And there you can see the built out version of that. So not a fancy project by any means, but you can see they even left some of the remnant of the asphalt art mural, a bit of a reminder of what came before it. So that's a project in one intersection. But that one project, because we were working with the Council of Governments, which is working regionally, understood that this was now a viable method for changing streets and for complete streets investment, not just around the region, but as it turns out, around the state. So we put together this guide for them as part of that effort, which looked at the things that are appropriate in a rural place, a suburban place, and more urban places. And that there are tactics and materials and things that, project interventions that work in various ways in those various places. And with that, over the last 5 years, we've gone out with the Council of Governments in the Hartford region, and we've worked across the state using a CDC grant. That's a 5-year grant to invest in active transportation. And that comes through the health department that the COG actually administers at a statewide level. So in short, you can see the impact of the work of the 42 projects. That's workshops, technical assistance, it's pilot or demonstration projects. It's kind of a whole range of things. It's buying bike racks, but we've reached about 34% of the state's population over those 5 years. So you can kind of see how you go from learning about how to do these projects and the methodologies, and then how to scale that up through something like receiving a federal grant. As we know, there's lots of federal resources that are coming for Louisiana and all the other states. So there's a way to think about where there's small successes and how to then catalyze those into long-term change. And then most recently, this project, this CDC-funded project has gone in behind a planning process that we led in New Haven, where we've looked at all the disparities in that community, where the investments are needed the most, particularly around safe streets, and we've invested in those changes with interim projects, things that, materials that will actually last. You may not be able to tell, but this is called street bond. It's much more durable than, say, the paint we used in New Britain, right? So we can dial in the amount of longevity and whatnot based on the material selection. So there you see a couple of the before and afters. One intersection, complicated intersection, challenging for this low-income neighborhood, where we took back almost 10,000 square feet of space for pedestrians and reduced the crossing distance by 55%. So I'm going to just speed forward here to my last example. Again, I hope you have access to this. But I wanted to end with this thought, that it takes something small as a catalyst. It took a 2004 plan, great, but it was many years later that the Better Block on Government Street catalyzed, from what I understand, the momentum that was needed to invest and bring the DOT, the city, neighborhood groups together to actually think about the transformative changes on that corridor. And I bet there are more than a dozen corridors that could use that, not just in Baton Rouge, but almost in every community around the state. So thinking small can inform the lasting change. And I think that's really key, right? We learn by doing, not by listening or necessarily reading. Some of us do, right? So if you remember 10% of what 20% of what I tell you today, or 10% of what you read in a book or a guide, that's great. But you would certainly remember going out and painting or doing, in your neighborhood. And it's a very effective way to kind of create that lasting change. So I think with that, I'm well over time, but thank you. Okay, I think we can actually take a couple questions if there are some in the audience. Hard to see. Anyone? All right, great. You guys want to get to the bar? Okay, cool. I will bring up Camille. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Whew. Well, that has been, this has been a very purposeful, intentional, and exciting 2 days. I'm so grateful to all of you for sharing the space with us, lending your expertise. I'm so grateful to all of our panelists and speakers who've traveled from all over to come lend their insights and be a champion for Louisiana. And I'm so incredibly grateful to the sponsors and all of you attendees. We could not do this without you. And throughout the day or the 2 days, people have asked me, "Oh, are you exhausted? Has this been stressful?" It's like, no, we planned for it. We planned for everything. And we have an army at CPEX that really did think of everything. And so I'd love all the CPEXers to stand up and for us to give them an applause. And I'll end with a quote from Mitchell Silver. He said in his keynote address that planning is about purpose. And so I plan to follow his example and keep my purpose in mind with everything I do, because I know that we can shape the future of Louisiana where our kids and grandkids can stay, contribute, enjoy our vibrant culture, and live healthy lives. And I hope that we all walk away with that mantra, let's plan with purpose. So thank you all. It's a wrap, and we hope to see you next year.